Hello, and thank you all for coming to this event on a looks like to be a sunny Friday. I'm going to present a qualitative activity and study which was part of the overall project, in which we spoke to and interviewed small and medium-sized creative businesses who work in the media industries in the UK. And who've used public domain materials previously. Yeah, it sounds a bit weird. Thank you. Oh, is that better? Is that better? That's better. This work sits between two or three other bodies of work, and I think that the contribution that we can contribute with this study to at least three debates. The first, I think, body of work that we hope that this contributes to is a body of sociology of media work, and this is research which is concerned with many aspects of the actual work process in creative firms, but a lot of the research has an explicit or implicit intellectual property dimension. Oftentimes in some of this research, particularly Hotho and Champion, who were writing about interactive video game studios, the firm is characterized as facing a choice between either engaging in a kind of work-for-hire model, where they take IP, which is given to them by someone else, a sort of a larger company, on a contract basis, and they produce something for hire which feeds into that larger IP, which is a third-party copyright-owned work. And in some of the sociology literature, the focus is on, well, how do they feel about working in that way? Workers feel dissatisfied because they don't feel like they have creative freedom in that kind of arrangement to do whatever they want with this IP, which has a lot of baggage attached to it as a commercial property. And so that has implications on the sociology side for attracting and managing creative people within the firm. But we're interested in something else. We're interested in understanding a bit better how the intellectual property arrangements and how the intellectual property ownership feeds into those sorts of issues. And we propose a third option to the Hotho and Champion model, not simply a work for hire or develop original work which is creatively satisfying on your own, but what about remixing, transforming, incorporating work which is in the public domain? So we want to explore that strategic option within firms. And so in that sense, I hope that the work also contributes to another body of research which has to do with innovation, and particularly innovation where the innovator does not own the underlying intellectual property exclusive right, if you like, in the innovation, where innovation might be open or shared or collaborative. And so there's a long body of work on this. Since Eric Raymond's work on sort of free and open source software projects, what is it about open collaborative innovation that makes things work? What makes these projects good? When there's no necessarily financial motivation for contributing to a project where you don't own a share in the IP. And so here we're interested in really what happens in terms of creative companies where they're working with underlying creative source material, such as the Sherlock Holmes character, which is now in the public domain, where they don't control the exclusive right in the source material, where others can take up and use the same work. So we have two research questions that we're addressing with this qualitative work. One is to try to identify the factors which prompt decisions by creative managers to use public domain materials in the first place. Why have they decided to embark on these projects? Secondly, there are two number ones. They're both equally important research questions. What strategies have commercial users of public domain materials adopted in that context of the problem of the protectability of the underlying source material? How have they responded to those specific challenges of working with public domain stuff? So our research method was essentially, rather than try to do a large-scale survey of all creative companies in the UK and ask them, well, have you worked with public domain material? I think that's an interesting research project if somebody would like to undertake that. What we did is we chose a smaller sample of firms by searching backwards on a list of known public domain works and seeing what was out there, seeing what firms in the UK had actually done with public domain work. We found a group of 39 firms. We contacted them, asked them to participate in interviews, and 22 of them agreed to speak with us, and we spoke with them. So we had a response rate of 56%, which I thought was good when working with small businesses who are obviously resource constrained. And we carried out semi-structured interviews with the help of 4 researchers, postgraduate research students in Glasgow. Megan, Shiona, Victoria, can you put up your hands and just, yeah. So we all 4 of us conducted these interviews. And we used iterative coding technique to first try to identify themes within the stories that we were hearing from these firms, and secondly, to try to develop a taxonomy, if you like, of models of exploitation of public domain material from that group. We're loosely basing our study on the value chain model, which has been quite heavily used in the media management literature as a way to try to understand the various points where creative firms generate value in a product for an end consumer. And it generally has, in these more recent models, 4 sort of production, if you like, phases of procurement, obtaining the source material, generation or production of the product, marketing, and finally distribution. And we followed some more recent work which focuses on the co-creative aspect of media production and added this 5th stage in the value chain, which we characterize as the sort of the user feedback into the value process. In terms of research question 1, right now we've identified sort of 4 main motivations for uptake of public domain materials within our sample of interviewed firms. The first group we characterize as working in partnership with public institutions, universities, arts council. They often have a public domain project sort of fall into their lap through that partnership process. And this is done in collaboration with public funding bodies. A second group we characterize as technological innovators. These folks are building technology which is really cutting edge and proprietary, and they're using public domain material as a placeholder, simply because it's convenient and they can use it without rights, permissions, or anything like that. But when the final product goes to market, often the public domain placeholder stays and turns out to be something which adds value to the end consumer. A third group of firms are deeply embedded in fan communities which are built up around these public domain literary works like the Sherlock Holmes fandom and others, which we'll hear from later today. And they're building products which are responding directly to needs which they're identifying as members themselves within a fan community of a text. And finally, a group of more, if you like, intellectually property aware entrepreneurs who are seeking and locating market opportunities and producing in order to meet that identified consumer demand. So they're a little bit more savvy and they're being a bit more proactive in terms of which public domain works they choose to work with. So I just want to, in 5 minutes, show you some of the raw data from the interviews, because I think some of it is very interesting and it gets to some of these really core problems which we're working with. This is from a company who flagged up to us that their decision to engage with public domain material was somewhat personal and somewhat strategic. This is a company we'll hear from later who is developing a project based on Jack the Ripper mythos, and noticed that the 125th anniversary of the Jack the Ripper mythos was coming, and that this was sort of an occasion which could be marked with a product. So it's both coming from interest and sort of marking a public event or anniversary. And there were many other examples of this kind of thinking in the creators who we spoke to. This is an author from Bristol who was looking at things around the 200th anniversary of Darwin's birth and the 150th anniversary of the publication of Origin of Species, and created a graphic novel biography of Darwin's life to commemorate that event. And it was co-funded with with local arts funding, and then later commercialized as a spin-out product. In terms of how the firms that we interviewed felt about working with public domain material at the level of actually creative production, there were some interesting differences between that sort of work and work on their own original projects or work on third-party copyright license projects. So, this was a quite entrepreneurial and technologically focused firm, but when we pressed them about which projects of all of their portfolio of projects they enjoyed working on the most, they actually pointed to these public domain fairy tale animations or animated classic literature animations. They did the Iliad, Through the Looking Glass, and Christmas Carol. And what they liked about working with that material was the creative freedom that they were able to enjoy, because they didn't have to ask anybody for permission in terms of how they organized or presented their adaptation of the work. So there was some creative and commercial freedom there. And that essentially there was cost savings because they didn't have to worry about the complexities of copyright law. They knew that the work was in the public domain. This is the author who worked on the Darwin graphic novel, talking again about how the availability of public domain images, such as their adaptations of Michelangelo's painting of the Sistine Chapel and paintings by Joseph Wright of Derby at the Lunar Society meetings, which they worked into the novel as a way of illustrating some of the questions of the day which Darwin's work was in relation to, was as a sense enriching and adding historical groundedness to the work, which made it better in their view. Here's somebody who was quite excited about working on Dracula because they were a lifelong fan of the Dracula story. He says, "It's so lodged in our imagination and it connects with our subconscious in all sorts of obscure ways. I've always enjoyed the old movies of it, but it was really the original book that inspired me to make the production. It's really a love of the book, the original material. The production seemed to connect with people, and it's good to capture the magic of something and share it with people." So there's lots of affective language in the way that he's describing working with this public domain text. So in a sense, it's one of creative freedom because there's no need to ask for permission, but just as many of the creators expressed the fact that actually they felt a certain degree of responsibility to the work because it was so canonical, and because there were so many other people familiar with it, that in fact they were sort of working in conversation with a public knowledge of a thing. And again, this entrepreneurial animation studio, we've heard from them already. In terms of the entrepreneurial firms, it seemed that possessing a previous experience with copyright law, understanding copyright term, availability, what can be taken, what can't be taken, seemed to shape the types of products that they made and the entrepreneurial choices that their firm took. And again, they're pointing to the administrative burden of rights clearance as a dissuasive factor from working with things which are maybe on the edge of being in the public domain, and suggesting that for their peers who were not as knowledgeable about copyright, this would be a barrier to competition. The big question, protectability. How do firms feel about working with public domain work where any other firm could take up the same material and release essentially a competing project? Most of our respondents did not see the non-excludability of the underlying public domain work as a problem. This is an interactive games developer saying, if you like the wrapping that we create, the technological wrapping will remain something that's ours. We have the proprietary IP there and the technology. There's nothing stopping anybody from saying, "Oh, they did that really well. We'd like to do that and make our own Jack the Ripper documentary." Reusing materials and heavily taking a gameplay style and things like that, which are part of the video games production industry anyway. So they didn't really view this as particularly problematic because those kinds of takings are common with other things like game mechanics. Here's a respondent who produced a series of YouTube nursery rhymes, animated nursery rhyme videos based on nursery rhymes which are in the public domain. Started several years ago, was very successful with it, and then found a flood of imitators who arrived on YouTube in the years following. And she sums it up that we were in the right place at the right time with the right idea. So the market is now very saturated, which is why I'm leaning a little bit away from that, working with public domain materials, but still trying to keep the public domain materials to support my other work. When you do find something in the public domain, something that at the time is still less known as a public domain item, and you use it creatively and it gets well known, that's fine, but you've moved on by the point when everyone's catching up with you. So her view on her creative firms, if you like, competitive advantage was that it came from their creative core capabilities, that their work was cutting edge, that it was great. Yes, there's going to be lots of imitators which come, but they're still able to exploit the market in the period of time between when they release something and when all of the imitators arrive. And I imagine that YouTube is a very competitive market with lots of sort of fast-moving imitation. I'm going to move ahead so that we have enough time for the third talk within the allotted time. Final point that I want to draw from the primary data is are some of the challenges that our respondents faced when working with public domain material. So it was both a challenge and a delight, I think, for some of these firms. One was that actually locating high quality underlying source material was often a challenge. It wasn't easy to actually get something which was useful for a new digital adaptation product. Here's the author from Bristol talking about finding this golden nugget of 100-year-old Annals of Bristol in the 17th, 18th, to the 19th century by John Latimer, which he has carefully read through dozens of times. He says these are very hard to get a hold of and very expensive if they do come up at all. But now they're available online and are searchable, which he thought was great, because now you could have new ways into that information which previously would have been difficult to get a hold of. And he talked about how his work as a historian has spun out into creative texts. That a bunch of steampunks showed up at his door and wanted to know about the Victorian history of Bristol. He told them about it, and they went off and wrote a book, which is called Airship Shape and Bristol Fashion, and is available from Wizard Tower Press, and contains some of that public domain information from that Latimer digital archive. So these folks worked on the Origins of Species work as well, and they talked us through the process, and they said that when they decided to embark on the process, they started thinking about what information was available, whether we could actually have access to it. We didn't consider that it might actually be freely available online. So when they looked into how much it would cost to have the book scanned and proofread, that we'd have the data, but in fact they found this online resource called Darwin Online. And then they worried about the quality of the data, because they thought, well, if it's online, it can't be very good. It must be kind of broken data, or it won't be useful. In fact, it was better, probably, because it had been peer-reviewed and proofread by all of the user community who feed into that Darwin Online resource. And so they were thrilled with the quality of the data and were able to build their work on top of that. Part of the creative problem, though, for them was that other people had access to the same underlying data, and so they felt greater scrutiny from that public about what their project ended up looking like, because other people thought the project should have been done differently. So there was a little bit more kind of unwelcome peer input. This is the visualization of their work which they did from the data, which is a visualization of the 6 different editions of Origin of Species. The final point I want to suggest, and we haven't had time to really elaborate this point yet, but what we are finding, I think, from the narratives, is that firms which are working with public domain material seem interested in engaging in a sharing economy paradigm, maybe a little bit more than their peers. So this Vox group, which is a very entrepreneurial firm, they're making money from these YouTube nursery rhymes, but they're offering the lyrics for free on their website as, for anybody to download. And they see that as kind of a service back to the community, suggesting that, well, we've taken something from the public domain, so we want to give something back. Other companies have talked about giving their data, their cleaned up data, back to the originators to use and improve upon. So I think that's an interesting possibility to explore further. We've mapped this all out using the value chain model, which I suggested before, and that will be available in the report. We've sort of tried to map all of the different opportunities and challenges against the various stages in the chain. We've modeled these a little bit more abstractly around the different approaches which we identified from the research. And I just want to close with 3 points. One is that I think what emerges from this research is a linkage between the IP awareness of a firm and their willingness to use both public domain material and third-party licensed copyright material. So they kind of need to be sophisticated about copyright to know when term expiry happens and those complexities which Danusha raised. In order to have that capacity, they're normally also working with other licensed work and in recombinatory ways. So we're not just talking about firms taking things from the public domain and not paying a license to rights holders. We're talking about firms who are really interested in licensing IP as well as working with stuff which is available in the public domain in combination. The low protectability was not cited as a disincentive. The strategies which they employed were, getting to market first, having great creative capabilities within the firm, having proprietary technology underlying their product, in which they own the right, and having a co-productive relationship with audiences which are improving the work because of its non-excludability, if you like. And finally, I think what's quite interestingly, perhaps theoretically here, is that given all of the complexity that Danusha raised, what we're seeing is that the public domain is not something which is just clearly delineated in law, and we can say, okay, all of these things are in the public domain, go nuts. Actually, the public domain seems to be constituted through use. And so if it wasn't for things like the Mechanical Curator Project, which you'll hear from soon, or the Darwin Online resource, or Museums and Archives, in Bristol, helping local firms find stuff that they're going to use in creative projects. If it wasn't for the actual, practices on the use level, these works wouldn't really be in the public domain. They would be abstractly in the public domain, but it's not until these communities of practice kind of form and collaborate that the work actually becomes unlocked and available and useful. Thank you. I'll stop there and hand over to Gavin.